It began as these things often do with love. A boundless, slightly foolish love, the kind a mother reserves for her child, even when that child is a grown woman with choices of her own. Clara, my Clara. She'd always been the sun in my sky, even during the turbulent teenage years, even when her father, my dear departed Thomas, worried she was too easily swayed. I saw only her brightness. When she met Mark, that brightness seemed to amplify. He was charming, attentive, full of ambitious talk and easy laughter. He painted visions of a future so vivid, so secure, I found myself swept along, wanting it for her as desperately as she seemed to want it herself. They were renting a cramped apartment then, dreaming of space, of gardens, of a place to build a life, raise the children they spoke of with starry eyes. And I had the means, or rather, I made the means. The villa wasn't just bricks and mortar. It was the culmination of my life with Thomas, the place we'd poured our savings, our sweat, our shared dreams into after years of careful planning. It sat nestled on a gentle slope overlooking the town, bathed in sunlight, surrounded by the olive trees Thomas had planted. After he passed, it felt too large, too quiet, echoing with memories I both cherished and fled from. Selling it felt like betraying him, betraying us. But seeing Clara's face light up when she spoke of wanting a home like the one she grew up in, it felt like a continuation, not an ending. Gifting it to her seemed the most natural thing in the world. It was more than I could perhaps truly afford to give away so freely, requiring me to significantly downsize my own life, move into the small, converted annex at the back of the property. Barely 2 rooms, really, but I told myself it was perfect. Close enough to help with future grandchildren, independent enough not to intrude. It felt like the perfect solution, a legacy of love passed down. The paperwork was straightforward, a deed of gift. My lawyer, old Mr. Henderson, had raised an eyebrow, suggesting clauses, life interests, safeguards. Eleanor, he'd murmured, his voice dry as parchment. Love is wonderful, but ink is clearer. I'd waved away his concerns, blinded by sentimentality and trust. She's my daughter, Robert. And Mark adores her, they wouldn't. I couldn't even finish the sentence. The thought was ludicrous. They were overjoyed, effusively grateful. Tears streamed down Clara's face as I signed the papers. Mark enveloped me in a hug that felt strong and protective. You've given us a future, Eleanor, he'd said, his voice thick with emotion. We'll never forget this. You'll always have a home here, always. Those words became my anchor, the bedrock of my decision, always. The first year was idyllic, or so it seemed through the rose-tinted lens I wore. They moved in, filling the large rooms with laughter and new furniture. Mark was often busy with his ventures, vague descriptions of consultancy work and potential startups, but he always had a smile for me, a quick inquiry about my day when he saw me tending the small patch of garden I'd kept by the annex. Clara blossomed, hosting dinner parties, talking excitedly about color swatches and landscaping plans. I helped where I could, babysitting their new puppy, offering recipes, listening. I kept to my small space, careful not to overstep, content in their reflected happiness. The villa seemed to sigh in contentment, alive again. I told myself the faint, occasional shadows, Mark's slightly too sharp tone when stressed, Clara's brief flashes of defensiveness if I offered unsolicited advice, were just normal adjustments, the settling in period of a shared life, a shared space. I was giving them room to breathe, room to make the home their own. It was what I wanted, wasn't it? For them to be happy, independent, secure in the beautiful house built on love. The slight chill I sometimes felt creeping into Mark's politeness, the way Clara occasionally avoided my gaze after a conversation with him, I attributed it to their own stresses, the pressures of building a life. Surely it had nothing to do with me. The shift was subtle at first, like the turning of the tide, barely perceptible until you realize the waterline has significantly moved. It began with Mark's comments, dropped casually, almost apologetically. Eleanor, we were thinking the main terrace is lovely, but perhaps it's best if we keep it primarily for our entertaining. For privacy, you understand. Privacy. In the home I gave them. I remember nodding, a tight feeling in my chest, murmuring something about understanding completely, while retreating further into my small annex. My little garden patch suddenly felt exposed, overlooked. Then came the suggestions about the shared utility bills. Mark, spreading spreadsheets on the large kitchen island I once planned my family meals on, explained with careful patience as if to a child how costs were mounting. We just need to be practical, Eleanor. Perhaps a more formal arrangement. It wasn't about the money, not really, the amounts were manageable, though a stretch on my now-reduced fixed income. It was the implication that my presence, my small usage of water and electricity in my own little corner was becoming a burden. The gift, the immense, life-altering gift of the villa itself seemed to evaporate in the face of these calculations. It was never mentioned. Clara stood beside him, tracing patterns on the granite countertop, her expression unreadable. When I caught her eye, she offered a quick, anxious smile. It's just logistics, Mum. Mark's good with these things. Her deflection stung more than Mark's directness. Was she truly this oblivious, or was she choosing not to see? The landscaping plans they'd been so excited about began to materialize, but not in the collaborative way I'd imagined. Mature shrubs I'd planted with Thomas were ripped out to make way for a sleek, modern water feature Mark wanted. When I voiced a quiet objection mentioning their significance, Mark chuckled. Got to modernize, Aliner. Out with the old, in with the new. He clapped me on the shoulder, a gesture meant to be friendly but feeling dismissive. Clara winced but said nothing. I started spending more time in the annex, the main house feeling less like a shared space and more like territory I needed permission to enter. The puppy they'd been so enthusiastic about now seemed largely my responsibility, its muddy paws apparently an inconvenience on their pristine floors. Yet Bruno, the golden retriever pup, became my shadow, my confidant, his unquestioning affection a balm to my growing unease. He'd curl up at my feet in the annex, a warm, breathing presence against the creeping chill. One afternoon, I overheard them arguing. Or rather, I heard Mark's raised voice, sharp and clipped, drifting from their open bedroom window. Clara's responses were tearful murmurs. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable: frustration, anger on his part, appeasement on hers. Later, Clara came to my door, her eyes red-rimmed but her smile firmly in place. Just silly stress, Mum. Mark's under a lot of pressure with work. She changed the subject quickly, asking about my plans for dinner, but the forced brightness didn't fool me. Something was wrong. The easy harmony of that first year was fracturing, replaced by a tension that hummed beneath the surface. Mark's charm, when directed at me, now felt like a performance, thin and brittle. He started forgetting to mention when they were having guests, leaving me to stumble upon gatherings feeling awkward and out of place. Little omissions, little slights, accumulating like stones in my pocket, weighing me down. Was this what always looked like? This slow, deliberate erasure? I tried talking to Clara, gently probing, asking if everything was all right between them, if she was happy. She became instantly defensive. Of course I'm happy, Mum. Why would you ask that? Mark is wonderful. We have this beautiful home, thanks to you. The mention of the villa felt like a shield she was holding up, deflecting any deeper inquiry. But her eyes didn't meet mine. She knew. She had to know something was changing, something was hardening in the atmosphere of the house, emanating from the man she loved. And she was choosing to ignore it, or worse, to enable it. The foundation of trust I had built my decision upon felt like it was slowly turning to sand beneath my feet. The politeness eroded, replaced by a barely veiled impatience, primarily from Mark. My presence in the main house, even for brief moments, seemed to irritate him. He'd sigh loudly if I was using the washing machine when he wanted it, or make comments about the television volume if I watched an evening program in the main living room, something I rarely did anymore. Some of us have work in the morning, Aliner, he'd say, heading towards the stairs without waiting for a response. Clara would flinch, sometimes murmuring a half-hearted apology on his behalf later. He's just stressed, Mum, becoming her constant refrain, a weak excuse that grated more each time I heard it. The renovations Mark had started continued, creeping closer to my annex. One morning I woke to the sound of hammering right outside my window. Workmen were erecting a trellis, a large, imposing structure designed for climbing vines, effectively screening my small patio area from the main garden. No one had mentioned it. When I found Mark directing the workers, I asked, my voice trembling slightly, Mark, what is this? He turned, his expression smooth, almost pitying. Just improving the aesthetics, Aliner, giving you a bit more privacy too. The irony was suffocating. He was walling me in incrementally under the guise of consideration. My tiny view of the olive trees Thomas planted was now obscured by raw timber. Later that day, Clara approached me, avoiding my eyes. Mark thought it would be nice, Mum. Define the spaces a bit more. Define the spaces. It sounded like something he would say. She was parroting him now, the words clumsy in her mouth. Clara, I said, keeping my voice low, this annex, my being here, it was part of the understanding when I gave you the house. Your father and I built this place. This small space was meant to be my home within the home. Her face crumpled slightly, a flicker of the daughter I knew. I know, Mum, but things change. We need our own life. The we felt like a deliberate exclusion. The unspoken without you hung heavy in the air between us. The arguments became less veiled. There was a dispute over the shared driveway. Mark wanted to resurface it with expensive cobblestones. I simply couldn't afford to contribute my share. His reaction was explosive, not shouting, but a cold, controlled fury that was far more unnerving. Look, Aliner, he said, standing too close, his voice tight. This is our house now. Our asset, we need to maintain its value. If you can't keep up your end, perhaps this arrangement isn't sustainable. Keep up my end? The sheer audacity stole my breath. I had given them the entire asset, a property worth hundreds of thousands, and he was talking about driveway contributions as if I were a delinquent tenant. Mark, I replied, my voice steadier than I felt, I gave you this house. This was my end. My presence here was the condition, the unspoken agreement between a mother and daughter. He laughed, a short, sharp, unpleasant sound. Unspoken agreements don't pay for cobblestones, do they? Clara and I need to think about our future. Perhaps you should too. He walked away, leaving me standing there, shaking with a mixture of anger and hurt. Clara, who had witnessed the exchange from the kitchen doorway, quickly busied herself with wiping down an already spotless counter. She offered no support, no word of defense. Her silence was a betrayal as profound as his words. That night I couldn't sleep. The villa, my beautiful home, felt alien, hostile. The scent of jasmine drifting from the garden, usually a comfort, seemed cloying, suffocating. I looked at the photograph on my small nightstand, Thomas and me, younger, beaming, standing on the plot of land before construction even began. His arm was around my waist, his eyes full of dreams. Our dreams. What had I done? How had my act of love, my legacy for our daughter, twisted into this ugly, suffocating reality? The quiet strength Thomas always said I possessed felt miles away, buried under layers of shock and disillusionment. I felt foolish, naive, and increasingly, profoundly alone. Bruno rested his head on my knee, whining softly, as if sensing my distress. Stroking his soft fur, I felt the first stirrings of something other than hurt, a cold, hard knot of resolve beginning to form in the pit of my stomach. This wasn't just about cobblestones or trellises. This was about respect, about dignity. This was about my home. The hammer fell not with a bang, but with a carefully worded, chillingly polite suggestion. It was a Sunday afternoon. Sunlight streamed into the main living room, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air, mocking the tension coiling in my stomach. Mark had asked me to join them for a chat. Clara sat on the sofa, fiddling with a cushion, her knuckles white. Mark sat opposite me in one of the expensive armchairs they'd bought, leaning forward slightly, his expression one of practiced concern. "Eleanor," he began, his voice smooth as silk, "Clara and I have been doing a lot of thinking about the future, about what's best for everyone." I waited, my heart pounding a heavy rhythm against my ribs. Bruno, sensing the atmosphere, pressed close against my legs beneath the coffee table. "This situation, well, it's becoming increasingly clear that it's not ideal for any of us." He paused, letting the words hang. "We feel, and Clara agrees," he glanced at her, and she gave a jerky little nod, refusing to meet my eyes, "that perhaps it would be better for you to find your own place. Somewhere smaller, more manageable for you. Closer to town, perhaps." My breath hitched. It wasn't a question, it was a statement wrapped in the thinnest veil of solicitude. "My own place," I echoed, my voice barely a whisper. "Mark, this is my place. The annex, this was always the arrangement." "Arrangements change, Eleanor," Mark said, his tone hardening slightly. "We need our privacy. We need to be able to live our lives, make decisions about our property without constraints." The word constraints hung in the air, ugly and accusatory. I was the constraint. My presence, my history, my very existence in the shadow of their lives was the problem. I turned to Clara, appealing to the daughter I thought I knew. "Clara, is this what you want? For me to leave the home I gave you?" She finally looked up, her eyes swimming with unshed tears, but her voice was strangely flat, devoid of emotion. "Mum, it's just difficult. Mark's right. It would be simpler. We could help you find somewhere nice. Simpler for them. Easier to forget the magnitude of the gift, easier to erase the silent reminder of how they came to possess this beautiful prison." The betrayal was absolute, breathtaking. It wasn't just Mark, the charming viper I'd welcomed into my family. It was my own daughter sitting there, calmly dismantling my life, my security, my sense of belonging. "I gave you everything," I said, the words raw, torn from my throat. "This house was my future, my security after your father died. I gave it to you out of love, trusting you'd honor the understanding. Trusting you, Clara." Mark cut in sharply. "Don't try to guilt-trip her, Eleanor. This is a practical decision. We're thinking of starting a family soon. We need the space." He gestured vaguely around the enormous room, as if the vast emptiness was somehow insufficient. "The annex could be a nursery or a home office for me. My small sanctuary repurposed for their convenience." The final insult. I looked from his cold, calculating eyes to Clara's averted, tear-streaked face. The image of them, side by side, united against me in the sunlit room filled with expensive furniture I'd indirectly paid for, burned itself into my memory. The photo of Thomas and me on my nightstand flashed in my mind, his trusting smile, our shared dream. Now it felt like a portrait of foolishness. "I see," I said, my voice hollow. I stood up, my legs unsteady. Bruno scrambled up beside me, a low growl rumbling in his chest, directed at Mark. "Perhaps you should control your dog, Eleanor," Mark said coolly. I didn't reply. I turned and walked out of the room, out of the main house, back to the annex he now coveted for an office. The heavy scent of jasmine seemed to follow me, no longer sweet but smelling of decay, of promises broken, of love turned to poison. The shock was a physical blow, leaving me winded, reeling. But beneath the shock, beneath the crushing weight of betrayal, that tiny knot of resolve I felt earlier pulsed, a stubborn ember refusing to be extinguished. They thought I would just fade away, find a smaller, more manageable place. They underestimated me. They underestimated the quiet strength forged through years of love, loss, and resilience. They had forgotten who I was. The suggestion quickly morphed into pressure. Mark started leaving brochures for retirement communities and small rental apartments on the table just inside my annex door. Subtle reminders. Then came the unsubtle ones. He began talking loudly on his phone in the garden outside my windows, discussing selling the villa, once we sort out the annex situation. It was psychological warfare, designed to wear me down, make me feel insecure and unwelcome. Clara seemed to avoid me altogether, her guilt a palpable barrier. If our paths crossed, she'd offer a fleeting, miserable smile and hurry away. The easy companionship we once shared felt like a distant memory, a different lifetime. I felt utterly alone, adrift in a sea of hostility within the very walls that should have represented safety and love. My small annex, once a cozy retreat, now felt like a besieged outpost. I jumped at every unexpected noise, my stomach constantly churning with anxiety. Sleep offered little respite, filled with dreams of falling, of being locked out, of Thomas looking at me with disappointed eyes. One evening, Mark knocked sharply on my door, not his usual light tap, but an impatient summons. I opened it to find him standing there, a sheaf of papers in his hand, his face set in hard lines. "Leaner, we need to formalize this," he said, no preamble, no pretense of politeness anymore. "We've spoken to a solicitor. This situation isn't legally tenable. You have no formal right of residency." He thrust the papers towards me. It wasn't an official eviction notice, not yet, but it was a letter drafted by his lawyer, outlining their position, stating their intention to reclaim full possession of the entire property, and giving me a deadline, 60 days, to vacate voluntarily. 60 days to dismantle my life, find somewhere else to live on my limited income, and walk away from the home I had poured my heart and soul into, the home I had gifted out of love. The cold, legalistic language of the letter was brutal, stripping away all emotion, all history, reducing our complex relationship, my immense sacrifice, to a mere property dispute where I was an inconvenient obstacle. "You can't be serious, Mark," I whispered, the papers trembling in my hand. "After everything, Clara knows this wasn't the deal. Clara knows we need to move forward," he retorted, his eyes like chips of ice. "We're being generous, offering 60 days. Legally, it could likely be much quicker, given there's no lease agreement. You're essentially squatting, a leaner, squatting, in my own home." The word struck me like a physical blow. He saw me as nothing more than an unwanted occupant, someone trespassing on his property. The injustice of it burned, searing away the fear, cauterizing the hurt, leaving behind a residue of pure, unadulterated anger. "Get out of my doorway, Mark," I said, my voice dangerously quiet. He seemed taken aback for a second, perhaps expecting tears or pleading. He gave a short, dismissive laugh. "Fine, read the letter, we expect your cooperation." He turned and strode back towards the main house, whistling softly, the picture of nonchalance. I closed the door, leaning against it, the rough wood cool against my burning cheek. The isolation felt absolute. Clara was lost to me, clearly under Mark's complete control, or perhaps willingly participating in this cruelty. Other family. My sister lived overseas, frail and elderly. Thomas's relatives had never been close. I had friends, yes, but how could I explain this humiliation, this bizarre, painful situation? The shame was immense. How could I have been so blind, so foolish? But intertwined with the shame was that burgeoning anger, that cold resolve. He called me a squatter. He thought I would crumble. He thought wrong. The villa stood silent around me, its familiar presence now feeling like a battleground. The olive trees outside the window, their leaves shimmering in the twilight, seemed to stand sentinel, witnesses to the unfolding betrayal. I wouldn't run. I wouldn't be intimidated. This wasn't just about a roof over my head. It was about reclaiming my story, my dignity, from the people who were trying to erase me. The fight had begun. The lawyer's letter was a cold slap of reality, but it also served as a catalyst. The fear and helplessness began to recede, replaced by a grim determination. I couldn't fight this alone. The first step was swallowing my pride and seeking professional help. Mr. Henderson, my old family lawyer, had long since retired, his warnings about ink being clearer than love echoing with bitter irony in my memory. I found a new solicitor, Sarah Jenkins, through a recommendation from a friend. Her office was small, functional, overlooking a busy street, a world away from the sun-drenched tranquility the villa was supposed to represent. Sarah was younger than I expected, sharp-eyed and direct, with an air of calm competence that I found immediately reassuring. I sat opposite her desk, clutching Mark's lawyer's letter, and recounted the whole sorry tale, from the joyful gifting of the villa to the veiled threats, the trellis, the final demand to leave. My voice shook initially, the shame still raw, but as I spoke, laying bare the manipulation and betrayal, the shaking stopped. Recounting the facts aloud solidified my resolve. Sarah listened patiently, taking notes, her expression sympathetic but professional. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair, tapping her pen gently on the notepad. "Okay, Alina," she said, her tone measured. let's be clear. Gifting the property means legally on paper it belongs to your daughter and presumably through marriage, jointly with her husband unless specified otherwise in the title deeds. Your name isn't on the deed anymore. The words landed heavily, confirming my deepest fears. So Mark is right, I have no legal right to stay. Not necessarily no right, Sarah corrected gently, but your position is certainly precarious because there wasn't a formal life interest or right of residency registered on the title when you made the gift. We're relying on the intent and understanding surrounding the gift, which can be harder to prove legally than a written clause. She explained the complexities, verbal agreements, promissory estoppel, the nuances of property law when family arrangements sour. It was daunting, a tangled web of legal jargon that underscored just how naive I had been. So what can I do? I asked, feeling a wave of despair wash over me. Fight, Sarah said simply, her gaze steady. Mark and your daughter are relying on you feeling intimidated, ashamed, and legally powerless. They're hoping you'll just leave quietly. We need to show them you won't. Her confidence was infectious. First, she continued, we need to gather evidence. Anything that substantiates the understanding that your residency in the annex was a condition, or at least a commonly accepted part of the gift. Emails, letters, cards, I racked my brain. Most of the discussions had been verbal, sealed with hugs and tears, not contracts. Witnesses, who had heard Mark's promise that I would always have a home there. Maybe my friend Carol, who'd been there the day I announced the gift. Think about conversations, Alina. Did anyone else witness Mark or Clara acknowledging your right to live there? Did Mark's behavior change suddenly, or was it gradual? Keep a diary now. Document everything, every interaction, every comment, every action they take that makes you feel uncomfortable or pressured. She also advised me to look into Mark's background discreetly. People who act this ruthlessly often have things they want to keep hidden. Financial pressures are a common motivator for this kind of behavior. Leaving Sarah's office, I felt a strange mix of apprehension and empowerment. The legal path was fraught with uncertainty, maybe even doomed, but taking action felt infinitely better than passively accepting their narrative, their dismissal of me. I was no longer just a victim of their cruelty, I was actively pushing back. That evening I sat down with a new notebook, the first clean page representing a new chapter. I started writing, documenting the slights, the comments, the dates, the growing chill. It was painful revisiting the memories, seeing the pattern of manipulation laid out in black and white, but it was also clarifying. I wasn't imagining it. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. This was deliberate. Bruno lay at my feet, his presence a quiet comfort. As I wrote, the image of Mark calling me a squatter flashed again. No, I wasn't a squatter. I was the woman who built this place, the woman who gave it away out of love. And I would fight for my right to exist within its walls, not just with lawyers and documents, but with the quiet, enduring strength they had so carelessly underestimated. The fight wouldn't be easy, but for the first time since Mark's cold pronouncement, I felt a flicker of hope, fragile but real. The process of gathering evidence felt like excavating my own life, sifting through memories both cherished and painful for proof of the promise they now denied. I contacted my friend Carol. Do you remember that day, Carol? I asked over the phone, trying to keep my voice steady. The lunch where I told everyone about giving the villa to Clara? Carol remembered vividly. Oh, absolutely, we were all so happy for her. And Mark made such a lovely speech, didn't he? About how grateful they were, how you'd always be looked after, always have your home there. He laid it on thick, Alina. Bingo, a witness to his words. Sarah Jenkins was pleased but cautioned that one friendly witness might not be enough on its own. We need more, she urged. Think about practicalities. Were there any joint decisions made early on that assumed your continued presence? I remembered the initial discussions about the garden layout, where Mark had actually asked my opinion on where the vegetable patch should go near your annex, Alina, so it's convenient for you. A small detail, but it implied an assumption of my long-term residency. I documented it meticulously in my notebook. I also started paying closer attention to Mark's activities discreetly, as Sarah had suggested. It wasn't difficult. He was often careless, leaving mail lying around, taking loud business calls in the garden. I learned he was involved in several investment opportunities that sounded suspiciously like pyramid schemes. Snippets of overheard conversations hinted at mounting debts, impatient creditors. Was this the pressure Clara kept mentioning? Was their desire to evict me driven not just by malice, but by a desperate need to liquidate the asset, my gift, to cover his financial recklessness? The thought sickened me, but it also provided a possible motive, something tangible beyond simple cruelty. One afternoon, Mrs. Gable, my elderly neighbor from the adjoining property, stopped me by the fence while I was walking Bruno. She was a sharp-eyed woman who missed very little. Everything all right over there, Alina? She asked, her gaze searching. Seems rather tense lately. Lots of loud talk from that husband of Clara's. I hesitated, unsure how much to reveal. But Mrs. Gable had always been kind, a link to the time before Mark. Taking a deep breath, I confided in her, outlining the situation, the threat of eviction. Her reaction was instant indignation. Evict you from the house Thomas built, the house you gave them, the absolute nerve? She then provided a crucial piece of information. You know, dear, I saw surveyors here last week while you were out shopping. Mark was with them, pointing towards your annex, talking about boundary adjustments and extension potential. Seemed very keen to maximize the footprint. Surveyors, boundary adjustments, extension potential. It confirmed Mark wasn't just thinking of an office. He likely saw my annex as space to be absorbed, increasing the villa's value before a potential sale. This wasn't just about getting rid of me. It was about erasing my space entirely for profit. Armed with this, I felt bolder. The next time Mark left one of his retirement village brochures outside my door, I didn't just throw it away. I walked over to the main house, found him in the kitchen making coffee, and placed it firmly on the counter in front of him. Mark, I said, my voice level, stop this, it's insulting. He looked up startled, then his eyes narrowed. Just trying to be helpful, Alina. No, I countered, meeting his gaze directly. You're trying to intimidate me, it won't work. I've spoken to a solicitor, I know my position isn't as weak as you think, and I know about the surveyors. His face tightened almost imperceptibly. A flicker of something surprise, anger, crossed his features before being quickly masked by his usual arrogance. My solicitor seems confident, he scoffed. And I can do what I like on my own property. We'll see about that, I replied, keeping my voice calm despite the adrenaline coursing through me. We'll see what a judge thinks about always having a home here. I used his own words, the ones Carol remembered, the ones he'd spoken with such apparent sincerity. For the first time, I saw a crack in his confident facade. He didn't have a snappy comeback. He just stared at me, his coffee forgot. I turned and walked back to my annex, Bruno trotting faithfully beside me. It was a small victory, a tiny shift in the oppressive atmosphere, but it felt significant. I had faced him directly, called out his tactics, shown him I wasn't going to be easily dismissed. The fear was still there, a cold knot in my stomach, but it was now mingled with a burgeoning sense of my own power. He had underestimated my resilience, and perhaps, just perhaps, he had overestimated his own position. The fight was far from over, but I was no longer just defending, I was pushing back. The tension in the villa ratcheted up after our confrontation. Mark became colder, more overtly hostile, dropping any pretense of civility. Clara seemed to retreat further into herself, her face etched with worry lines that hadn't been there a year ago. There were hushed, urgent phone calls behind closed doors, and I noticed Mark spending more time hunched over his laptop, his brow furrowed. Something was definitely amiss in his world, beyond his campaign against me. My solicitor, Sarah, filed a formal response to their lawyer's letter, outlining our position, citing the verbal agreement, Carol's testimony, and Mrs. Gable's information about the surveyors as evidence of intent contrary to eviction. We requested mediation as a first step, hoping to avoid a costly court battle. The response from Mark's lawyer was dismissive, reiterating their stance but significantly agreeing to mediation. Sarah saw this as a small crack. He might be bluffing, she mused. Or perhaps his own lawyer sees potential weaknesses in his case and wants to test the waters before committing to court. The waiting period before the mediation date was excruciating. Every day felt like walking on eggshells. Mark took to making petty annoyances, parking his large SUV, deliberately blocking my access to the shared path, accidentally turning off the water mains while doing maintenance. Bruno became my early warning system, growling softly whenever Mark approached the annex. One rainy Tuesday afternoon, everything changed. I was in my small kitchen area making tea when I heard shouting from the main house. Not just Mark's controlled anger this time, but Clara's voice, raised in a way I hadn't heard since she was a teenager arguing about curfew. It was raw, anguished. How could you lie to me about all of it? Bruno stood alert by my door, whining uneasily. Curiosity warring with a reluctance to intrude, I edged closer, straining to hear through the connecting wall. Lost everything? Clara sobbed. The money father left me, it's gone. Mark's voice was placating, defensive. It was an investment, Clara, a temporary setback, I can get it back. Like you got back the money from the last investment, she shot back, her voice laced with bitterness. You used my inheritance. And now you want to sell Mum's house? The house she gave us to cover your gambling, your debts? Gambling, debts. So it wasn't just bad investments. My blood ran cold. He hadn't just manipulated me, he had systematically betrayed Clara too, gambling away her security, her inheritance from Thomas. The pieces clicked into place. His desperation to get rid of me, sell the villa, wasn't just about greed. It was about survival, about covering his tracks before his whole house of cards collapsed. The argument raged on, doors slammed, more tears flowed. I retreated from the wall, feeling sick. This was worse than I imagined. Clara wasn't just complicit in his cruelty towards me, She was another victim of his deception, trapped in a web of lies and financial ruin. A strange mix of emotions washed over me, vindication that my suspicions about Mark were horribly correct, but also a profound sadness for Clara, for the mess her life had become. Later that evening, there was a hesitant knock on my annex door. It was Clara. Her face was pale, tear-streaked, her eyes hollowed out. She looked utterly broken. "Mum," she whispered, her voice cracking. Can I come in?" I stepped aside, opening the door wider. She stumbled in, collapsing onto my small sofa, burying her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking with uncontrollable sobs. Bruno nudged her gently with his nose, whining softly. I sat beside her, putting a tentative arm around her. For a long moment there were only the sounds of her weeping and the rain drumming against the window pane. Finally she lifted her head, her eyes pleading. "He lied, Mum, about everything. The money, the business. He even lied about needing the space for a nursery. Wants to sell the house to pay off gambling debts." The confession poured out of her, the extent of Mark's deceit, the forged signatures, the secret loans, the constant pressure he'd put on her to support his eviction plan against me, convincing her it was the only way they could secure their future. She admitted she'd had doubts, knowing feelings that something was wrong, but she'd pushed them away, desperate to believe in the dream he'd sold her. "I was so stupid," she wept. "So blind, and so cruel to you." Seeing her like this, stripped bare of the defenses she'd erected, I felt the last vestiges of my anger towards her dissolve, replaced by a weary sorrow. She had made terrible choices, yes, aligning herself with him against me, but she was also trapped, manipulated by a man far more calculating than she had realized. This revelation, this breakdown, was the turning point. Mark's carefully constructed world was imploding. His primary ally, his shield, had just seen the monster behind the mask. The power dynamic had irrevocably shifted. The mediation session was scheduled for the following week. Clara, oscillating between tearful remorse and a newfound, shaky anger towards Mark, provided Sarah with copies of bank statements she'd found hidden in Mark's desk drawer, revealing the extent of his gambling losses and the depletion of her inheritance. It painted a damning picture. Mark, meanwhile, seemed oblivious to Clara's shift. He maintained his arrogant swagger, though I noticed a slight desperation creeping into his eyes when he thought no one was watching. He clearly believed Clara was still under his thumb, that the mediation would be a mere formality before I was forced out. The session took place in a neutral conference room at Sarah's firm. Just me, Sarah, Mark, his solicitor, a stern-looking man named Peterson, and Clara, who insisted on attending despite Mark's objections. The mediator, a calm, experienced woman named Mrs. Davies, laid out the ground rules: respectful communication, focus on finding a resolution. Mark started, or rather, Peterson started for him, reiterating their position. The gift was absolute, no right of residency existed, Alina's presence was hindering their enjoyment and potential use of the property, and they required vacant possession. It was the same cold, legalistic argument from the letter. Then it was Sarah's turn. She calmly presented our case. The clear verbal understanding at the time of the gift, witnessed by Carol, Mark's own initial actions acknowledging my residency, the vegetable patch discussion, the pattern of intimidation and harassment designed to force me out, Mrs. Gable's testimony about the surveyors and Mark's plans to absorb the annex. She painted a picture not of a generous gift met with changing circumstances, but of calculated manipulation from the outset. Mark shifted uncomfortably, his jaw tightening. Peterson looked impassive. Sarah paused, then looked directly at Mark. "Furthermore," she said, her voice steady, "we have reason to believe Mr. Thorne's desire to evict Mrs. Vance is driven less by a need for privacy or space, and more by pressing financial difficulties resulting from significant gambling debts, which he has concealed from his wife and attempted to remedy by planning the sale of the property gifted by her mother." Air crackled with tension. Mark shot bolt upright. "That's an outrageous lie, slander." Peterson put a restraining hand on his arm, whispering urgently. Clara, sitting beside me, took a deep, shuddering breath but remained silent, her gaze fixed on Mark. Sarah continued calmly, "We have documentation suggesting substantial withdrawals matching known gambling platforms, and evidence that Ms. Vance's inheritance, entrusted to Mr. Thorne, has been depleted without her full knowledge or consent." She slid copies of the bank statements Clara had provided across the table towards the mediator and Peterson. Peterson's eyes widened almost imperceptibly as he scanned the figures. Mark's face went from red to deathly pale. He stared at Clara, betrayal and fury warring in his eyes. "You," he hissed, forgetting the mediator, the lawyers, everything. "You went through my things, you sided with her." Clara finally met his gaze, her own eyes filled with a mixture of fear and newfound strength. "You lied to me, Mark. You used me. You tried to turn me against my own mother to cover your tracks. It stops now." The confession hung in the air, undeniable. Mark's facade crumbled completely. He looked trapped, cornered, his arrogance evaporating, leaving behind only a desperate, twitching anger. Peterson cleared his throat, looking deeply uncomfortable. "Mrs. Davies," he addressed the mediator, his tone suddenly much more conciliatory, Perhaps a short recess would be beneficial. Mrs. Davies nodded curtly. Mark didn't seem to hear. He was still glaring at Clara, his voice dropping to a venomous whisper. You'll regret this. The threat was palpable, ugly. Sarah stood up abruptly. I think this session is over for now. My client is not safe here. She ushered Clara and me towards the door. As we left, I saw Mark bury his head in his hands, Peterson speaking to him in low, urgent tones. Outside the conference room, Clara leaned against the wall, trembling. I can't go back there, Mum, she whispered. Not with him. You won't have to, I said, putting my arm around her shoulder. The resolution wasn't fully formed yet, the legalities still tangled, but one thing was clear: Mark's reign of terror was over. He had been exposed, his manipulations laid bare, his power broken. It wasn't the clean legal victory I had initially sought, but it was something far more profound. It was the reclamation of truth, the shattering of lies. The villa, the symbol of my love and his betrayal, might still be legally complex, but his moral claim to it, his ability to use it as a weapon against me, had been utterly destroyed. The bittersweet reality settled in. I had exposed the man who had hurt us both, but the cost was the complete implosion of my daughter's marriage and the uncertain future of the home that held so many memories, both beautiful and brutal. The aftermath was messy, emotionally draining, but ultimately liberating. Mark, facing exposure and potential legal action from Clara regarding the misappropriated inheritance, quickly agreed to move out of the villa. His departure was swift and sullen, devoid of apology or remorse. He left behind a trail of unpaid bills and the wreckage of his relationship with my daughter. Clara, fragile but resolute, stayed with me in the annex initially. The main house felt vast and empty, haunted by the ghost of their failed marriage and Mark's toxic presence. We talked for hours, days. Tears were shed, apologies offered and accepted. The deep wound of betrayal between us began the slow process of healing, though the scars I knew would always remain. Legally, the situation required careful navigation. Sarah Jenkins worked with Clara's new lawyer to untangle the financial mess Mark had created and to formalize the ownership of the villa. Given that I had gifted it solely to Clara, Mark's name was never on the deed, a small mercy stemming from his initial desire to avoid scrutiny of his own finances. And given his demonstrable misconduct, Clara retained full ownership. The question then became, what next? Clara couldn't afford the upkeep on her own, burdened now with debts Mark had accrued partially in her name. Selling it seemed the logical option, but the thought pained us both. It was still the house Thomas and I had built, the place where Clara grew up. Selling it felt like letting Mark win in a way, forcing us out through his destructive actions. We explored options, renting out the main house, dividing the property legally, but ultimately we realized the villa itself was too intertwined with the pain of the recent past. Living there, even just in the annex, felt like living under a shadow. We needed a fresh start, both of us. So we made the difficult decision to sell. It was heartbreaking watching the for sale sign go up, seeing strangers troop through the rooms filled with echoes of laughter and tears. But it was also necessary. The sale process was surprisingly quick. The villa, despite everything, was still beautiful, desirable. The proceeds allowed Clara to clear the debts Mark had saddled her with and gave her a modest nest egg to start rebuilding her life. It also provided enough for me to find my own place, a small, bright apartment in a quiet building closer to town, overlooking a park. It wasn't the villa, didn't hold the same history, but it was mine, truly mine. No conditions, no unspoken agreements, just peace and independence. Clara found her own small place nearby. Our relationship is different now. The naive trust is gone, replaced by a more cautious, more mature understanding. We are closer in some ways, bound by the shared trauma and the slow rebuilding, but the mother-daughter dynamic has shifted. She sees me not just as mum, but as a leaner, a woman who found her strength when pushed to the brink. And I see her not as the easily swayed girl Thomas worried about, but as a woman learning resilience, picking up the pieces of her life with courage. Sometimes I walk past the villa. New owners are landscaping, painting, making it their own. It evokes a pang of bittersweet nostalgia, a phantom limb ache for the dream it once represented. But the overwhelming feeling isn't loss, it's relief. Relief from the tension, the fear, the suffocating weight of betrayal. I lost the house I loved, the house I built with my husband, the house I gave away out of boundless affection. But I gained something far more valuable, my self-respect, my voice, my freedom. Mark tried to evict me, to erase me, to render me powerless. He underestimated the quiet strength that resides in women like me, women who have loved deeply, lost greatly, and learned to endure. He saw vulnerability and mistook it for weakness. He didn't realize that sometimes the deepest betrayals forge the strongest resolve. I sit now in my own small living room, sunlight streaming through the window, Bruno snoozing at my feet. It's not a villa, but it's home. And it's enough. More than enough. I am no longer defined by the walls I inhabit, but by the strength I discovered within them. I am a leaner Vance, and I am finally free.